The day my cousins changed the locks on my grandparents' Victorian mansion, telling me I was not welcome on Harrington property anymore, I didn't cause a scene. I simply nodded, walked back to my car, and drove away. 3 weeks later, when the director of the State Historical Society called to inform me that I, not my cousins, held exclusive preservation rights to the 150-year-old estate, the expression on Lawrence's face as I unlocked the new front door with my own key told me everything I needed to know. He finally realized what his greed had cost him. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. But let me start from the beginning. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who would fight for an inheritance. I always believed in earning my own way, building something through hard work and determination rather than waiting for someone else's legacy to fall into my lap. That's what integrity meant to me. But sometimes life forces you to stand your ground, not for money or possessions, but for something far more valuable: the truth about who you are and where you come from. My name is Eleanor Reed, though everyone calls me Ellie. I grew up in Mapleton, Massachusetts, a postcard-perfect New England town with more history than current residents. My childhood was split between two worlds: the modest two-bedroom apartment above my mother's bookstore downtown, and weekends at Harrington House, my grandparents' sprawling Victorian estate on the edge of town. Harrington House wasn't just any old family home. Built in 1873 by my great-great-grandfather Thomas Harrington, a shipping merchant who'd made his fortune in the China trade, it stood as a monument to both family history and American craftsmanship. 3 stories of weathered brick and intricate woodwork, surrounded by 5 acres of gardens that had once been the pride of the county. My grandfather, William Harrington, was the last male to carry the family name. He'd married my grandmother Charlotte in 1952, and they'd had 2 children, my mother, Elizabeth, and my uncle James. When my mother fell in love with Daniel Reed, a literature professor with more passion than money, the Harrington family dynamics fractured in ways that would echo for decades. You see, the Harringtons had expectations. Specific expectations about who their children would marry, what careers they would pursue, how they would conduct themselves in Mapleton society. My mother defied all of these by choosing love over lineage. When she announced her engagement to my father, my grandfather didn't speak to her for nearly a year. Uncle James, meanwhile, followed the prescribed path. He married Vanessa Mitchell, daughter of the town's most prominent attorney. He took over management of the family's remaining investments. He joined the right clubs, donated to the right charities, and maintained the Harrington name exactly as expected. His children, my cousins Lawrence and Meredith, were raised to see themselves as the rightful heirs to everything the Harrington name represented. I was born a year after my parents married. We lived above the bookstore my mother opened with her modest inheritance, the only thing my grandfather would give her after what he called her unfortunate choice. My father taught at the local college, writing poetry in the evenings that received critical acclaim but little financial reward. Despite the family rift, my grandmother Charlotte refused to shut my mother out completely. When I was 5, she began inviting me to spend weekends at Harrington House. My grandfather pretended to object, but secretly delighted in teaching me about the family history, showing me artifacts from the family's past, and walking me through the gardens he tended with religious devotion. "This house has a soul, Ellie," he told me once as we sat on the widow's walk that crowned the mansion. "It remembers everyone who's ever lived here. Someday it will remember you, too." Those weekends at Harrington House were a revelation. I discovered family portraits dating back generations, journals written by ancestors I'd never known existed, furniture that had crossed oceans and survived wars. Most importantly, I discovered a sense of belonging that transcended my grandfather's disappointment in my mother's choice. My cousins were always there too, of course. Lawrence, 4 years older than me, made it clear from the beginning that I was an outsider. "You're not a real Harrington. he told me when I was 6, after I'd accidentally knocked over a porcelain figurine. You're just Charity. Meredith, closer to my age, occasionally showed moments of warmth, but ultimately followed her brother's lead in treating me as an interloper. Their mother, Aunt Vanessa, perfected the art of the backhanded compliment. How clever of Elizabeth to dress you so practically, or your academic achievements are impressive, considering your educational limitations. My Uncle James rarely acknowledged me directly, speaking about me in the third person, even when I stood right beside him. The Reed girl seems to have her mother's artistic tendencies, he might observe to my grandmother, as if I were a mildly interesting specimen rather than family. Despite this treatment, I treasured those weekends. My grandmother taught me to play the grand piano in the music room. My grandfather showed me how to prune the heritage roses that his grandfather had first planted. In the estate's vast library, I discovered authors who would shape my thinking for years to come. When I was 12, my father died unexpectedly, a heart attack while jogging on a spring morning. My mother was devastated, and our already precarious finances became truly dire. The bookstore barely provided enough for us to live on, let alone cover unexpected expenses. It was my grandmother who stepped in, overriding my grandfather's objections. "They're family, William," I overheard her say one night when they thought I was asleep. "And family means something, even when they disappoint us." She established a trust fund for my education and invited my mother and me to Sunday dinners at Harrington House, a significant elevation from my weekend visits alone. My grandfather, perhaps softened by my father's death, began to thaw toward my mother, occasionally asking about the bookstore and even recommending titles he thought she should stock. By the time I graduated high school as valedictorian, my grandfather had come to accept, if not fully embrace, my place in the family. When I was accepted to Harvard, the university attended by Harringtons for 4 generations, he presented me with his father's fountain pen. "For taking notes." "In lectures," he said gruffly. "A Harrington should always have the proper tools." My cousins watched these developments with growing resentment. Lawrence, who had struggled to maintain a B average at the private academy Uncle James had paid handsomely for him to attend, particularly bristled at my academic success. When he barely managed admission to a second-tier state college, the contrast with my Harvard acceptance created tension that Aunt Vanessa did nothing to diffuse. "Not everyone has the luxury of focusing solely on schoolwork," she commented at the family dinner celebrating my acceptance. "Lawrence has had social obligations and family responsibilities that naturally affected his studies." I didn't point out that Lawrence's social obligations primarily involved partying with his wealthy friends and crashing expensive cars that Uncle James quietly replaced. I had learned long ago that defending myself only made things worse. Harvard, I studied architectural history and preservation, fascinated by the stories old buildings could tell. I spent summers interning with preservation societies across New England, learning how to document historical structures and navigate the complex regulations that protected them. My senior thesis on adaptive reuse of 19th-century industrial buildings won departmental honors. After graduation, I was offered AA with the Boston Preservation Alliance, a prestigious nonprofit dedicated to protecting historic architecture throughout Massachusetts. The salary was modest, but the work was fascinating and aligned perfectly with my values. Meanwhile, Lawrence had dropped out of college after 2 lackluster years and returned to Mapleton to help manage family interests, which primarily meant occupying an unused office in my uncle's building and drawing a salary for nebulous consulting work. Meredith had completed a business degree and joined a marketing firm in Boston, the only member of that branch of the family to establish a career independent of the Harrington name. Through my 20s, I built my reputation in the preservation community. My work took me throughout New England, documenting endangered historical structures and helping communities develop preservation plans. I published articles in professional journals, spoke at conferences, and eventually was appointed to the state's historical commission as its youngest ever member. All this time, my connection to Harrington House remained strong. I visited my grandparents at least twice a month, often staying weekends to help my grandfather with the gardens, which were becoming too much for him to manage alone. I cataloged the family archives, discovering photographs, letters, and documents that filled in gaps in the Harrington history. My grandmother passed away when I was 27, a peaceful death in her sleep after a long and generally healthy life. My grandfather, bereft without his partner of over 60 years, seemed to age a decade in the months that followed. My mother and I increased our visits, often staying several days at a time to ensure he was eating properly and taking his medications. Uncle James and Aunt Vanessa made appearances for Sunday lunches, bringing Lawrence, who had by then moved into a carriage house on the property that my grandfather had renovated for him, and occasionally Meredith, when she could be persuaded to drive, in from Boston. These gatherings were strained, with conversation revolving around town gossip and reminiscences about people long dead. During this period, my grandfather began to speak more explicitly about the future of Harrington House. "This place needs someone who understands its value," he told me one evening as we sat in his study, surrounded by family photographs spanning generations. "Not just its market value, but its historical and emotional value." I assumed he was speaking generally, perhaps contemplating donating the property to a historical society after his death. It never occurred to me that he might be reconsidering the family inheritance traditions that had always favored the male line. On my 30th birthday, my grandfather invited me to lunch, just the two of us, in the formal dining room that seated 20 but rarely hosted more than 6. The table was set with the spode china that had been a wedding gift to my great-grandparents, and he had instructed Mrs. Bennett, the housekeeper who had served the family for 3 decades, to prepare my favorite meal. After dessert, he handed me an envelope. "I've made some decisions," he said, his voice steady despite his 84 years. "I want you to know about them while I'm still here to explain my reasoning." Inside the envelope was a copy of his revised will, along with documentation establishing the Harrington House Historical Trust. The will stipulated that upon his death, Harrington House and its grounds would be placed in the trust, with me named as principal trustee and preservation director. Uncle James would receive a substantial financial bequest, as would my mother. Lawrence and Meredith would receive smaller but still significant cash inheritances. Various family heirlooms were specifically distributed among all the descendants. But the house, the heart of the Harrington legacy, would become my responsibility. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. "You understand what this place means," my grandfather said, watching my face as I absorbed the implications of the documents. "James sees it as an asset. Lawrence sees it as his birthright. Neither of them sees it as I do, as you do." The trust documentation specified that Harrington House would be maintained as a family residence, but also open to the public for historical tours and educational programs several days each month. A substantial endowment would cover maintenance, costs, and my salary as director, ensuring the property could be properly preserved without financial strain. "You don't have to accept," he added when I remained speechless. "If it's too much." "It's not too much," I assured him, finding my voice at last. "It's an honor. But Uncle James—" "Lawrence?" My grandfather's expression hardened slightly. "James has been well compensated throughout his life. As for Lawrence," he sighed, "that boy has never valued anything he didn't have to work for. Perhaps this will be the motivation he needs to make something of himself." I didn't share my grandfather's optimism about Lawrence, but I understood his decision. Still, I was concerned about the family conflict this would inevitably create. "I've discussed this with my attorney, with historical preservation experts, and with my own conscience," my grandfather said, correctly reading my hesitation. This is the right decision for Harrington House, even if it's not the decision James or Lawrence would prefer. I accepted the responsibility, though I asked my grandfather not to announce the change to the family immediately. Let's give them time to adjust to the idea, I suggested. Perhaps introduce the concept of the trust first, before revealing who will manage it. He agreed, though I suspected he knew, as I did, that no amount of preparation would make Uncle James or Lawrence accept this change willingly. For the next 6 months, my grandfather's health seemed to stabilize. He began joining me on my weekend visits to historical properties around the state, his interest in preservation growing as he saw the possibilities for Harrington House. We developed plans for opening the main floor to guided tours, for creating a research library from the family archives, and for restoring the gardens to their original design. During this time, I noticed increasing tension whenever Uncle James visited. My grandfather had apparently begun discussing his plans for a trust, though he had not yet revealed my role as trustee. Uncle James clearly assumed he would control any such arrangement. The financial implications need careful consideration. I overheard him telling my grandfather, property taxes alone, and the maintenance costs, we might need to consider selling some of the outlying acreage. My grandfather shut down such suggestions. The property remains intact, he insisted, as it has for 7 generations. Lawrence, meanwhile, had begun bringing friends to the estate for impromptu parties, treating Harrington House as if it were already his personal property. Twice I arrived for weekend visits to find empty beer bottles scattered across the veranda and cigarette burns on antique side tables. When I confronted him, he merely laughed. "Lighten up, cousin," he said, slouching in a chair that had once belonged to a Massachusetts governor. "Someday this will all be mine anyway. Might as well start enjoying it now." I didn't correct his assumption. That wasn't my place, but I did start documenting the condition of rooms before and after his visits, photographing any damage and keeping detailed notes. Something told me this evidence might be needed later. The situation came to a head at Thanksgiving. My grandfather had insisted on hosting, despite his increasingly fragile health. The entire family gathered, my mother and I, Uncle James and Aunt Vanessa, Lawrence and Meredith, the latter visibly uncomfortable with the simmering family tensions. Dinner proceeded with superficial pleasantness until my grandfather tapped his water glass for attention as Mrs. Bennet served coffee. "I have an announcement," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "As some of you know, I've been working with my attorneys to establish the Harrington House Historical Trust to ensure this property remains intact and properly maintained after I'm gone." Uncle James nodded, a satisfied smile suggesting he anticipated being named trustee. "What you don't yet know," my grandfather continued, "is who will direct this trust." He reached for my hand across the table. "Ellie has agreed to serve as trustee and preservation director. Her education and professional experience make her uniquely qualified to ensure Harrington House receives the care and recognition it deserves." The silence that followed was absolute. My mother squeezed my other hand supportively. Meredith looked surprised but not displeased. Aunt Vanessa's face froze in a mask of social politeness that didn't reach her eyes. Uncle James recovered first. "Dad, with all due respect, this is highly irregular. The Harrington estate has always passed through the male line. Lawrence is your grandson, your namesake. And what has he done to demonstrate his commitment to this family's legacy?" my grandfather interrupted, a rare edge in his voice. "Whereas Ellie has dedicated her career to preserving historical properties, exactly like this one." Lawrence's face had flushed an alarming shade of red. "This is bullshit," he snarled, throwing his napkin onto his plate. "You're giving our family home to her? She's not even a real Harrington." "Lawrence," Aunt Vanessa hissed, but the damage was done. My grandfather rose from his chair, leaning heavily on his cane, but radiating the authority that had always commanded respect. Eleanor Reed has shown more appreciation for the Harrington legacy than you have demonstrated in your entire life. The decision is made, the documents are signed, this discussion is closed." With that, he excused himself, moving slowly but deliberately toward his study, his sanctuary from family conflicts for as long as I could remember. The aftermath was predictable. Uncle James launched into a measured but forceful argument about family tradition, financial practicalities, and my supposed lack of qualification despite my professional background. Aunt Vanessa made pointed comments about outside influences and manipulating an elderly man's affections. Lawrence stormed out, slamming the front door hard enough to rattle the antique glassware in the dining room cabinets. Only Meredith showed a hint of grace, meeting my eyes briefly with what might have been apologetic acknowledgement before following her parents as they made their excuses and departed. I helped Mrs. Bennet clear the table while my mother checked on my grandfather. When she returned, her expression was worried. "He's very tired," she said quietly. "This confrontation took more out of him than he expected. I think we should stay tonight." We did stay, settling my grandfather into bed early and taking up our usual guest rooms. Around midnight, I woke to strange sounds from down the hall. Finding my grandfather's bed empty, I traced the noise to the bathroom, where he lay on the floor, conscious but unable to rise. The ambulance arrived within minutes. The heart attack was severe but not immediately fatal. For 3 days, my grandfather lingered in the ICU, occasionally lucid enough to recognize visitors, but mostly lost in a haze of medication and failing organs. Uncle James and Aunt Vanessa made brief appearances. Lawrence didn't come at all. Meredith visited once, bringing flowers and a card, though she didn't stay long. My mother and I took shifts at his bedside. During one of his more lucid moments, my grandfather gripped my hand with surprising strength. "The house," he whispered. "Remember what I told you. It has a soul." "I remember," I assured him. "I'll take care of it. I promise." He died the following morning, slipping away peacefully with my mother holding one hand and me the other. The Harrington patriarch was gone, and with him the buffer that had maintained family peace despite underlying tensions. I had no idea how quickly those tensions would erupt into open warfare, or how far my cousins would go to challenge my grandfather's final wishes. The days following my grandfather's funeral passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and grief. My mother and I stayed at Harrington House, sorting through the immediate necessities while trying to process our loss. Mrs. Bennet continued her duties with quiet efficiency, though her red-rimmed eyes betrayed her own mourning for the man she'd served for nearly 30 years. Uncle James and his family kept their distance, communicating only through his attorney, a stern-faced woman named Gloria Whitfield, who specialized in contesting wills. Her emails were coolly professional, but carried an unmistakable undertone of threat. She requested all documentation relating to William Harrington's mental state in the months before his death, along with complete records of Eleanor Reed's interactions with the deceased during the period when significant changes were made to his estate plan. "They're building a case for undue influence," my attorney, Michael Sanderson, explained when I forwarded these requests. "It's standard practice when someone contests a will. Document everything, but don't engage directly. Let me handle all communications." Michael was a Harvard classmate who had specialized in historical property law and had helped my grandfather establish the Harrington House Historical Trust. He understood not just the legal complexities, but the emotional weight of what we were defending. "Your grandfather's estate plan is solid," he assured me. He was examined by 2 separate physicians who certified his mental competence when the documents were signed. The trust's purposes align with his long-established interests in historic preservation. And most importantly, there's a clear logical connection between your professional background and the responsibilities he assigned to you. What Michael couldn't provide was protection from the personal aspects of family conflict. Lawrence began showing up at Harrington House at odd hours, sometimes visibly intoxicated, demanding to speak to me about his inheritance. Twice I had to threaten to call the police before he would leave the property. Meredith reached out once, inviting me to meet for coffee in town. Unlike her brother, she seemed more resigned than angry about the situation. "I'm not here to argue about the will," she said, stirring her latte absently. "Honestly, none of us spent as much time with grandfather as you did. Mom and Dad visited out of obligation, and Lawrence was only interested in the money." Her candor surprised me. "Then why—" "Family loyalty," she interrupted with a wry smile. "You know how it is. Dad's been ranting about the Reed girl stealing our birthright for weeks. Mom's convinced you manipulated grandfather somehow. And Lawrence." She sighed. "Lawrence has spent his entire life being told he was the Harrington heir. He doesn't know who he is without that identity. I studied my cousin, seeing her clearly perhaps for the first time. Beneath the carefully applied makeup and designer clothes, Meredith looked tired, troubled by the family drama, but unwilling to break ranks entirely. "What do you want, Meredith?" I asked gently. She hesitated. "I want access to my childhood, the piano I practiced on for 12 years, the portrait of great-grandmother Elizabeth that hung in the blue bedroom, the Christmas ornaments Mom and I made together." Her voice cracked slightly. "I know it's not my house anymore, but it still holds pieces of me." Her request was reasonable, more than reasonable. "Of course," I told her. "Those memories belong to all of us. I'm not trying to erase the past, Meredith. I'm trying to preserve it." She nodded, a hint of relief softening her features. "I'll talk to Lawrence. Try to make him understand. He's not thinking clearly right now." I appreciated her attempt at peacemaking, but I had spent enough time with Lawrence over the years to know his sense of entitlement wouldn't be easily overcome. Still, having one cousin who didn't view me as the enemy felt like progress. 3 weeks after the funeral, my mother returned to her apartment above the bookstore. "You need space to settle in as the new mistress of Harrington House," she said with gentle humor. "And I need my own books and my own bed." I understood her reasoning, though I missed her steady presence as I navigated my new role. The transition from weekend visitor to property trustee was more challenging than I had anticipated. Each day brought decisions large and small, from scheduling necessary repairs to determining which family heirlooms should be secured and climate-controlled storage. Mrs. Bennett proved invaluable during this period, her institutional knowledge of the house and its contents guiding me through the labyrinth of maintenance schedules, vendor relationships, and domestic routines that kept Harrington House functioning. She also provided insight into which battles were worth fighting. "Mr. Lawrence has always used the south garden entrance when coming home late," she advised when I considered changing the locks after finding muddy footprints through the kitchen one morning. "Perhaps limiting access rather than eliminating. It would cause less friction." I took her advice, installing a keypad lock on the main entrances while leaving Lawrence's usual access point unchanged. It was a small concession that I hoped might demonstrate my willingness to accommodate family needs within reasonable boundaries. Meanwhile, I began implementing the plans my grandfather and I had developed for the property's future. I contacted the State Historical Society to initiate the process of listing Harrington House on the National Register of Historic Places. I consulted with museum curators about best practices for preserving the home's original features while making it accessible for limited public tours. I began cataloging the family archives, discovering letters, photographs, and documents that filled in gaps in the Harrington history. The work was absorbing, occasionally overwhelming, but deeply satisfying. For perhaps the first time in my life, I felt I was exactly where I belonged, doing exactly what I was meant to do. Then came the morning that changed everything. I woke to the sound of voices, angry, masculine voices, coming from the first floor. Throwing on a robe over my pajamas, I hurried downstairs to find Lawrence and Uncle James in the main foyer, accompanied by 2 men in workman's clothes and tool belts. "What's going on?" I demanded, tightening the belt of my robe as I confronted this unexpected invasion. Uncle James straightened his tie, his expression a mixture of determination and discomfort. "Eleanor, we didn't expect you to be here." "I live here now," I reminded him, my attention shifting to the strangers. "Who are these men, and why are they in this house at 7 in the morning?" Lawrence stepped forward, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "They're here to change the locks, all of them, including your precious keypad systems." The pit of my stomach dropped, but I kept my voice steady. "On whose authority?" "Mine," Uncle James replied, producing a document from his breast pocket. "Judge Hamilton has granted us temporary conservatorship of the estate pending resolution of our challenge to the will. You'll be receiving the official notification later today, but we decided to expedite certain security measures." I took the paper with trembling hands, scanning the legal language that effectively stripped me of control over Harrington House. Words and phrases jumped out at me. Substantial questions regarding testamentary capacity, possible undue influence, preservation of assets during litigation. "This is ridiculous," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "The trust documentation is legally sound. Grandfather was completely competent when he signed it." Uncle James's expression didn't change. "That will be for the court to decide. In the meantime, the property returns to family control." "I am family," I reminded him, anger beginning to replace shock. "You know what I mean," he replied dismissively. "Now, you have two options. You can remove your personal belongings today under supervision, or we can have them packed and delivered to your mother's address." I stared at him in disbelief. "You're evicting me? From my own home?" "It's not your home," Lawrence interjected, dropping all pretense of civility. "It was never your home. You're just the charity case my grandfather felt sorry for." "Lawrence," Uncle James cautioned, though his tone suggested the rebuke was for manner rather than content. I looked from one to the other, these men who shared my blood but none of my values. The injustice of the situation was staggering, but I recognized the futility of arguing with them in that moment. I needed my attorney, needed time to understand what had happened and how to fight it. "I'll need at least 2 hours to pack essentials," I said finally, folding the court order and placing it in my robe pocket. "And I want Mrs. Bennet to assist me." Uncle James nodded. "That's acceptable, but all rooms will be inventoried before and after you enter them." The implication that I might steal from my own inheritance was almost more than I could bear, but I swallowed my outrage and turned toward the stairs. Lawrence's voice stopped me. "One more thing, cousin," he called, the self-satisfaction evident in every syllable. "You're not welcome on Harrington property anymore. Not the house, not the gardens, not the grounds. Try to enter without permission, and we'll have you arrested for trespassing." I didn't give him the satisfaction of a response. Instead, I climbed the stairs with as much dignity as I could muster, waiting until I reached my bedroom before allowing the tears to fall. Mrs. Bennet found me there 10 minutes later, her normally impassive face creased with concern. "Miss Ellie," she whispered, closing the door behind her. "This is unconscionable." I wiped my eyes, forcing myself to focus on practicalities. "They can't do this, can they? Legally?" She sighed. "I'm no lawyer, miss. But Mr. James has always had friends in high places. Judge Hamilton's wife is on the same charity board as Mrs. Vanessa. Of course, the Harrington network of influence extended throughout Mapleton's social and professional circles. Uncle James would have called in every favor, leveraged every connection to wrestle control of the property away from me. "Help me pack," I said, pulling myself together. "Clothes and personal items first, then my grandfather's papers from the study, the ones we hadn't cataloged yet." Mrs. Bennet nodded, already moving toward the closet. "Mr. Lawrence is watching the study," she warned. "He won't let you take documents." She was right. When I attempted to enter the study to retrieve the archival materials I'd been working with, Lawrence physically blocked the doorway. "Personal items only," he said, arms crossed over his chest. "Family papers stay here." "These are research materials," I argued. "Documents I need for the historical registry application." His expression darkened. "There won't be any historical registry. No tours, no educational programs, none of that nonsense you filled grandfather's head with. Harrington House is a private residence, and it's going to stay that way." I recognized the futility of arguing. Instead, I focused on salvaging what I could: clothing, jewelry, my laptop and research notes, and a few books that had belonged to my grandmother. Under Uncle James's cold supervision and Lawrence's openly hostile gaze, I packed my car with the fragments of the life I had begun to build at Harrington House. Mrs. Bennet hugged me at the door, slipping a folded piece of paper into my hand. "My home number," she whispered, "for when you need information." I squeezed her hand gratefully before turning to face Uncle James and Lawrence one last time. "This isn't over," I told them, my voice calm despite the storm of emotions inside. "Me. Grandfather's wishes will be honored." Uncle James adjusted his glasses, regarding me with something almost like pity. "You've put us all through enough disruption, Eleanor. It's time to accept reality and move on." Lawrence was less diplomatic. "Face it, cousin. You lost. The real Harringtons are back in control." I didn't dignify his taunt with a response. Instead, I walked to my car with my head held high, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing how deeply their actions had wounded me. As I drove through the gates of the estate that had been my home and my heritage, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Lawrence stood on the front steps, watching my departure with undisguised triumph. The message was clear. I had been judged, found wanting, and exiled from my own legacy. For the first time since my grandfather's death, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that his wishes might go unfulfilled. The Harrington influence in Mapleton ran deep. Uncle James had money, connections, and the benefit of the family name. What did I have? A legal claim that had already been undermined by a temporary court order, a handful of hastily packed belongings, and the bitter taste of injustice. I drove to my mother's apartment, where she welcomed me with open arms and practical questions. "How long do you need to stay? Should we clear the guest room or will the sofa do for now? Have you called Michael?" Her matter-of-fact approach steadied me. This wasn't a tragedy. It was a setback. A battle lost, but not the war. I called Michael immediately, forwarding him a photo of the court order. His reaction confirmed my worst fears. "Judge Hamilton has a reputation for favoring old Mapleton families," he said after reviewing the document. "This is unusual, granting a temporary conservatorship without even a hearing, but not entirely surprising given the connections involved." "So, what do we do?" I asked, pacing my mother's small living room. "We fight," he said simply. "We request an immediate hearing to challenge the conservatorship. We accelerate the historical registry application. And we gather evidence of your cousin's intentions for the property." "What do you mean?" Michael's voice took on a sharper edge. "Your grandfather created that trust for specific purposes: historical preservation, public education, maintaining the integrity of the estate. If your uncle and cousin are already taking actions contrary to those purposes, that strengthens our case considerably. It was a strategy, a way forward. But legal proceedings would take time, and every day that passed gave Uncle James and Lawrence more opportunity to alter, damage, or even sell pieces of the Harrington legacy. There's something else to consider," Michael added, his tone cautious. "The Harrington House property has significant historical value beyond your family's personal connection. There might be regulatory protections already in place that your cousins are unaware of." This caught my attention. "What kind of protection?" "I'm not certain yet," he admitted. "But properties of that age and architectural significance often have preservation restrictions that limit what owners can do, regardless of who holds the title. Let me make some inquiries. After we hung up, I tried to settle into my temporary exile. My mother's apartment was warm and welcoming, but crowded with the inventory from her bookstore. We managed to clear enough space in the guest room for a twin bed and a small desk where I could work. That night, lying in an unfamiliar bed surrounded by boxes of romance novels and mystery paperbacks, I made a promise to myself and to my grandfather's memory. I would not let the Harrington legacy be diminished by greed or spite. I would find a way to honor his wishes, to protect the house that had sheltered 7 generations of my family. Lawrence's smug face flashed in my mind as I drifted toward sleep. "You're not welcome on Harrington property anymore," he had declared, so certain of his victory. What he didn't realize, what none of them understood, was that removing me physically from Harrington House didn't sever my connection to it. The soul of the place that my grandfather had spoken of lived in me now too, and I would fight with every resource I possessed to protect it. The battle for Harrington House had only just begun. The week following my eviction from Harrington House was one of the most challenging of my life. Each morning, I woke in my mother's guest room, momentarily disoriented before remembering that the home I had come to love was now off-limits to me. The stark white walls of the tiny bedroom were a far cry from the ornate wallpaper and crown, molding of my room at the estate. The distant sounds of Main Street traffic replaced the gentle rustling of century-old oak trees outside my window. My mother, ever practical, gave me the space to grieve while insisting I maintain a semblance of normal routine. "Self-pity makes a comfortable bed but a poor home," she quoted, one of the many aphorisms she had collected over years of reading. "Your grandfather wouldn't want you wallowing." She was right, of course. Wallowing wouldn't recover Harrington House or fulfill my promise to preserve it. Action would. I established a makeshift office at a corner table in my mother's bookstore, spreading out my notes and laptop amid the comforting smell of old paper and coffee from the cafe next door. The familiar environment helped me focus as I worked with Michael on our legal strategy. "The hearing to challenge the conservatorship is scheduled for next month," he informed me during one of our daily calls. "Judge Hamilton's calendar is conveniently full until then." "That gives Lawrence and Uncle James weeks to do whatever they want with the property," I pointed out, frustration evident in my voice. "Which is why we're pursuing multiple avenues simultaneously," Michael reminded me. "I've submitted emergency petitions to freeze any potential sales or significant alterations to the property. And I'm still looking into those preservation regulations I mentioned." I had been conducting my own research, reaching out to colleagues in the preservation community for insight and support. The response was encouraging but limited by the private ownership of Harrington House. Without official historical designation, outside intervention would be difficult to justify. 3 days after my eviction, I received an unexpected text message from an unknown number. "Garden shed key still under blue pot. L room untouched. Call after 7. MB Mrs. Bennett." The housekeeper's initials and her reference to Lawrence's room confirmed the sender's identity. My heartbeat quickened as I considered the implications. She was offering access to the property. Clandestine access, certainly unauthorized by my uncle or cousin. Part of me hesitated. Entering the property against a court order, even one as questionably obtained as the conservatorship, could jeopardize our legal position. But something in Mrs. Bennett's message suggested urgency, a need for communication outside official channels. I waited until 7:15 that evening before calling, allowing time for her to finish serving dinner to the house's current occupants. "Miss Ellie," she answered immediately, her voice hushed. "Are you somewhere private?" "Yes," I assured her, closing the door to my tiny bedroom. "What's happening, Mrs. Bennett?" She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "They're making changes. Mr. James has had appraisers in to value the furniture, the art, even the architectural elements. Mr. Lawrence has been offering items to his friends as gifts when his father isn't around. My stomach clenched. What kind of items? The Tiffany lamps from the library, your grandmother's silver tea service, 3 paintings from the upstairs hall. Her voice faltered. And yesterday he had someone looking at the carved banister, talking about how much mahogany would be worth if salvaged. The banister, hand-carved by a master craftsman in 1873, featuring intricate depictions of local flora and fauna. It was one of the home's most remarkable architectural features, irreplaceable both historically and artistically. They can't do this, I whispered, though I knew the temporary conservatorship likely gave them exactly that power. There's more, Mrs. Bennet continued. Mr. James has been removing papers from your grandfather's study, boxes of documents taken to his office downtown. This was potentially more serious than furniture theft. Those papers could include evidence supporting my grandfather's intentions for the property, documentation that might be crucial to our case. Have they discovered the wall safe? I asked, referring to the hidden compartment behind a painting in the study where my grandfather had kept his most important papers. No, miss. That painting hasn't been moved. At least some small mercy. The safe contained the original architectural plans for Harrington House, along with the first trust documents establishing the family's ownership of the property in the 1870s. Historical evidence that might prove invaluable. What about the historical registry application materials? I asked, thinking of the work I'd begun before being forced out. All gone from the desk, but Mrs. Bennet hesitated. I may have made copies of some documents before they were taken. For archival purposes, of course. I smiled despite the situation. Mrs. Bennet's prim exterior concealed a surprisingly subversive spirit. Of course, for the archives. I can leave them in the garden shed this evening. The blue pot by the north wall still hides the spare key. Mr. Lawrence never goes near the gardens. Too much physical work involved. The offer was tempting, but risky. If they catch you helping me, I've served Harrington House for 30 years, Miss Ellie. I know every creaking floorboard, every schedule, every routine. Besides, Mr. James and Mr. Lawrence barely notice I exist unless they need something. She was right. The privilege of wealth often renders service workers invisible to those they serve. In this case, that invisibility might work to our advantage. Be careful, I said finally. And thank you, Mrs. Bennet. Your grandfather was a good man who treated me with respect, she replied simply. I won't stand by while his wishes are disregarded. After we hung up, I called Michael to update him on the situation. This is concerning but not surprising, he said when I described the appraisals and removals. Classic strategy, liquidate valuable assets before the court can stop them. Can we use this information in our case? Absolutely, but we need documentation. Dates, times, names of appraisers, descriptions of items being removed or sold. Mrs. Bennet is gathering what she can, I told him, explaining her offer to leave materials in the garden shed. Michael fell silent, considering the legal implications. Technically, retrieving documents from the property could be problematic, given the conservatorship, he said finally. But if the documents pertain directly to the historical significance of the house, a case could be made that you're acting to preserve historical records, not violating the court order. It was a fine line, legally speaking, but I had already decided to cross it. Some risks were worth taking. There's something else you should know, Michael added. My contact at the State Historical Society has been reviewing the preliminary materials you submitted before all this happened. She believes Harrington House may qualify for expedited consideration, given its architectural uniqueness and the potential threat to its preservation. This was unexpected good news. How expedited? Possibly within weeks rather than months. But they would need access to the property to complete their assessment. An idea began forming in my mind. What if the access came from the current conservators? If they believed allowing an assessment would increase the property's value? Michael caught on immediately. A Trojan horse approach. Interesting, but risky. Your uncle is no fool. No, but he is predictable. He respects authority and values. Appearance. The right pressure from the right source might work. We spent the next hour developing this secondary strategy while I prepared for my clandestine visit to retrieve Mrs. Bennet's documents. Night had fallen by the time I parked my car on a side street several blocks from Harrington House. Dressed in dark clothing and carrying only my phone and a small backpack, I approached the property from the north side, where dense landscaping offered the most cover. The estate's perimeter was marked by an ornate wrought iron fence, but I knew every gap and weak point from childhood explorations. Behind the caretaker's cottage, vacant since the previous groundskeeper retired 2 years earlier, a section of fencing had shifted with the growth of a massive oak tree, creating a narrow opening just wide enough for a person to slip through. Heart pounding, I navigated familiar paths through the darkened grounds. Though it had been years since I'd sneaked onto the property this way, muscle memory guided me past the reflecting pool, through the rose garden, and finally to the small stone shed that housed gardening tools and supplies. The blue ceramic pot still sat beside the north wall, looking innocuous among the other planters. I upended it carefully, finding the key exactly where it had always been. Some things, at least, remained unchanged. Inside the shed, the air was heavy with the scent of potting soil and fertilizer. A battery-powered lantern had been left on a workbench, illuminating a manila envelope with my initials. Beside it lay something unexpected, a small brass key on an antique fob featuring the Harrington family crest. I recognized it immediately. It was the key to my grandfather's wall safe, which I thought had been locked inside the safe itself. Mrs. Bennet had somehow retrieved it, understanding its importance without being told. I tucked both the envelope and key into my backpack, preparing to retrace my steps off the property. As I reached for the shed door, voices outside froze me in place. Waste of money, if you ask me. Lawrence's voice slurred slightly. He'd been drinking. Why maintain gardens no one uses? Your father believes in appearances, a second male voice responded. Someone I didn't recognize. Besides, once the estate sells, the new owners will want the grounds intact. Sells? My blood ran cold. Were they already planning to sell Harrington House? If it were up to me, I'd subdivide the whole 5 acres, Lawrence continued. Luxury condos would make a fortune in this location. The voices grew fainter as the men moved toward the main house. I waited until I could no longer hear them before slipping out of the shed and making my way back to the perimeter fence, mind racing with this new information. Luxury condos, subdivision, the estate sells. The threats to Harrington House were more immediate and more severe than I had imagined. My uncle and cousin weren't simply challenging my inheritance. They were planning to dismantle my grandfather's legacy entirely. Back in my car, I examined the contents of the envelope. Mrs. Bennet had been thorough. She had copied correspondence between my grandfather and historical preservation experts dating back several years, demonstrating his long-standing interest in securing protected status. For the property, she had included recent invoices for appraisals of furniture, artwork, and architectural salvage, evidence of the Harringtons' intentions to liquidate assets. Most valuable of all, she had somehow obtained and copied a draft proposal from a real estate development company outlining potential options for maximizing return on the Harrington estate, including the subdivision Lawrence had mentioned to his companion. I drove directly to Michael's apartment where he was still working. Despite the late hour, he examined each document carefully, his expression growing increasingly grim. This is worse than I expected, he admitted, studying the development proposal. They're not just planning to sell off furniture, they're actively exploring dismantling the entire estate. Can we stop them? The question felt inadequate in the face of such a comprehensive threat. Michael tapped the development proposal. This document is dated 3 months ago, before your grandfather's death. They've been planning this for some time. The betrayal stung anew. While my grandfather was still alive, still believing his son and grandson shared his love for their heritage, they had been plotting to convert that heritage into luxury condominiums. That actually works in our favor, Michael continued. It suggests their challenge to the will isn't about preserving family legacy, as they claim, but about financial gain. A judge might view that distinction significantly. But the hearing is still weeks away, I reminded him. They could do irreparable damage in that time. Michael nodded, his expression shifting from concern to determination. Then we accelerate. I'll file emergency motions first thing tomorrow, using these documents as evidence of imminent threat to historically significant property. He sorted through the paperwork again, pausing at the correspondence between my grandfather and preservation experts. These letters establish your grandfather's intent beyond question. Combined with your professional background in preservation, they create a compelling narrative that supports the trust he established. For the first time since my eviction from Harrington House, I felt a glimmer of hope. We had evidence now, concrete proof of both my grandfather's wishes and my relative's true intentions. What about the key? Michael asked, examining the brass safe key with interest. It opens my grandfather's wall safe in the study. There may be additional documents inside that could help our case. He frowned. Accessing the main house is considerably riskier than visiting the garden shed. If you're caught inside— I know, I interrupted. But if the safe contains what I think it does, it could be worth the risk. We debated the merits of another clandestine visit versus the legal ramifications if I were discovered. Ultimately, we decided to wait until we saw the court's response to our emergency filings. If legal channels offered a viable path forward, the added risk might be unnecessary. The next morning, Michael submitted our emergency motions, including a request for a temporary restraining order to prevent any sales or alterations to the property pending full review of the case. By noon, we had received notice that Judge Hamilton, the same judge who had granted the conservatorship to Uncle James, had scheduled a hearing for the following day. That's unusually quick, Michael observed when he called with the news. Either he's genuinely concerned about the potential historical loss, or he's giving my uncle a heads up to accelerate whatever they're planning, I finished grimly. Either way, we need to be prepared. Go through every document Mrs. Bennett provided. We need to create an airtight case for the historical significance of Harrington House and the imminent threat to its integrity. I spent the day combing through the materials, organizing them into a compelling narrative that emphasized my grandfather's long-standing commitment to preservation. By evening, I had compiled a detailed timeline of events, from his initial consultations with experts through the establishment of the trust to the current threats facing the property. As I worked, my phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Bennett. Trucks tomorrow morning, furniture being moved to storage, paintings are already gone. They were emptying the house. Whether in anticipation of the restraining order or simply accelerating their plans, Uncle James and Lawrence were stripping Harrington House of its contents that were as much a part of its historical significance as the physical structure itself. I forwarded the message to Michael, who responded immediately. We need photographs. Current state of rooms, empty spaces where items have been removed, anything showing active dismantling. Mrs. Bennett's reply was prompt. We'll try. Not safe during the day. Too many workers. She was right. The risk of discovery was too high during active removal operations. But this development added urgency to our approaching court hearing. Without intervention, Harrington House would soon be an empty shell, its historical context scattered to the winds. That night, I slept fitfully, dreams filled with images of Harrington House being disassembled piece by piece, while I watched helplessly from beyond the iron fence. I woke before dawn, anxiety propelling me into action hours before the scheduled hearing. As I dressed in my most professional attire, a charcoal suit that had once seemed excessively formal for my preservation work, but now felt like armor, my phone chimed with an incoming email. The sender was unfamiliar. Daniel Westbrook, Director, State Historical Society. The subject line made my heart skip. Harrington House, urgent preservation concern. I opened it with trembling fingers, unsure whether to expect an ally or another obstacle. The first lines told me everything I needed to know. Dear Ms. Reed, the State Historical Society has been alerted to potential imminent threats to the architectural and historical integrity of Harrington House, 1873. Our records indicate that an application for historical designation was initiated but remains incomplete. Given the property's exceptional significance and the urgent nature of the current situation, I have authorized an emergency assessment team to visit the site today. As the applicant of record, your presence would be valuable during this assessment. The Historical Society was intervening, not someday, not eventually, but today. The exact day when trucks were arriving to remove the house's historical contents. The timing couldn't have been more critical. I forwarded the email to Michael with a single question. Coincidence? His reply came seconds later. No such thing. My contact came through. For the first time in weeks, I felt the momentum shifting. We weren't just reacting to my uncle's maneuvers anymore. We were forcing him to respond to ours. The Historical Society's involvement introduced a new authority, one that even James Harrington would find difficult to dismiss. As I headed to meet Michael before the hearing, my phone buzzed with a final message from Mrs. Bennett. 4 trucks. Already here. Mr. James supervises personally. Mr. Lawrence not present. The battle for Harrington House was reaching its critical moment. Today would determine whether my grandfather's legacy would be preserved for future generations or carved into luxury condominiums by those who valued profit over heritage. I straightened my shoulders and took a deep breath. Whatever happened. In court today, I would face it with the same dignity and determination that had guided generations of Harringtons, even if the current bearers of the name had forgotten what that legacy truly meant. The Mapleton County Courthouse stood at the center of town, its granite facade and columned entrance projecting the solid permanence of law and order. As I climbed the worn marble steps beside Michael, clutching a portfolio containing our evidence, the building's imposing presence felt both reassuring and intimidating. Remember, Michael cautioned quietly, Judge Hamilton has already shown bias toward your uncle. Keep your responses factual and unemotional, no matter what accusations they make. I nodded, throat too dry for speech. Despite my professional experience presenting to boards and committees, this hearing felt fundamentally different. This wasn't just about a historic building. It was about my family, my heritage, my promise to my grandfather. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled with high ceilings and surprisingly uncomfortable benches. Uncle James and his attorney, Gloria Whitfield, were already seated at one table. Lawrence was notably absent, a strategic decision I suspected, given his volatile temperament. Uncle James acknowledged me with a curt nod as we entered, his expression betraying nothing. Ms. Whitfield didn't even glance up from her papers. Their confidence was palpable, as if the outcome were a foregone conclusion. We had barely settled at our table when the bailiff announced Judge Hamilton's arrival. The judge was older than I'd expected, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. That gave him a scholarly appearance at odds with the reputation for bias that preceded him. This is an emergency hearing regarding conservatorship of the Harrington estate, he began without preamble. I understand from the plaintiff's filing that there are concerns about preservation of assets. Michael rose. Yes, Your Honor, we have evidence that the temporary conservators are actively removing historically significant items from the property and are pursuing plans that would irrevocably damage its architectural integrity. Judge Hamilton's gaze shifted to me briefly before returning to Michael. What is the nature of this evidence? Michael presented copies of the documents Mrs. Bennett had provided, the appraisal invoices, the draft development proposal, the correspondence, demonstrating my grandfather's preservation intentions. As the judge reviewed them, Ms. Whitfield leaned toward Uncle James, whispering urgently. "These are serious allegations," Judge Hamilton said finally, looking at Uncle James. "Mr. Harrington, perhaps you'd like to respond?" Uncle James buttoned his suit jacket as he stood, the picture of dignified indignation. "Your Honor, these documents represent routine estate management. Any responsible conservator would inventory assets and explore options for maximizing property value. Nothing has been done that cannot be undone." "And the removal of furniture and artwork currently underway?" Michael pressed. A flicker of surprise crossed Uncle James's face. He hadn't expected us to know about today's activities. He recovered quickly. "Standard conservation procedures. Many items require specialized storage to prevent deterioration." Judge Hamilton pursed his lips, clearly weighing the competing claims. I feared we were losing ground until Michael played our final card. "Your Honor, there's another factor to consider. The State Historical Society has initiated emergency assessment procedures due to the property's exceptional historical significance." He produced a copy of Daniel Westbrook's email. "Their representatives will be visiting the property today. Their findings could have significant legal implications for how the estate can be managed, regardless of who holds conservatorship." The change in the atmosphere was immediate. Judge Hamilton removed his glasses, polishing them slowly as he digested this information. Uncle James and Ms. Whitfield conferred in urgent whispers. "Is this true, Ms. Reed?" the judge asked, addressing me directly for the first time. "The Historical Society has taken an interest in Harrington House?" I stood, grateful for the hours spent practicing my response with Michael. "Yes, Your Honor. Prior to my grandfather's death, he and I began the application process for inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places. The Historical Society has expedited their assessment due to concerns about preservation." Judge Hamilton replaced his glasses, his expression thoughtful. "This introduces a regulatory complication I hadn't anticipated." He turned to Uncle James. "Mr. Harrington, were you aware of your father's efforts to pursue historical designation for the property?" Uncle James hesitated, caught between admitting knowledge that would undermine his position or claiming ignorance that would suggest he didn't understand his father's intentions. "My father mentioned the possibility several times," he finally admitted, "but he never took concrete steps toward formal designation. The correspondence and evidence suggests otherwise," Judge Hamilton noted, gesturing to the documents before him. "Given these developments, I'm inclined to modify the temporary conservatorship." Ms. Whitfield rose quickly. "Your Honor, my client has acted in good faith to preserve family assets. Any modification would be premature before full hearings on the will contest." The judge nodded acknowledgement but seemed unmoved. "Nevertheless, the Historical Society's involvement creates a new legal context. I am ordering an immediate halt to removal of any items from Harrington House pending their assessment. Furthermore, Ms. Reed is to be granted full access to the property for purposes of facilitating the historical evaluation." I struggled to maintain a neutral expression as elation surged through me. Access to the property, exactly what we needed, most urgently. "Your Honor," Ms. Whitfield objected, "such access creates opportunity for interference with the estate assets under conservation." Judge Hamilton fixed her with a stern gaze. "Ms. Whitfield, historical preservation is a matter of public interest that transcends private ownership disputes. Ms. Reed's professional background makes her participation in the assessment process appropriate and necessary." He turned to me. "However, Ms. Reed, this access is limited to historical preservation activities. The conservatorship otherwise remains in effect until the full hearing." "I understand, Your Honor," I replied, trying to keep the triumph from my voice. The judge made several additional technical rulings before concluding the hearing. As we gathered our materials to leave, I noticed Uncle James's rigid posture and tightly controlled expression. We had won this skirmish, but his demeanor promised the war was far from over. Outside the courthouse, Michael allowed himself a small smile. That went better than expected. Hamilton is clearly uncomfortable with the Historical Society's involvement. It introduces oversight he can't control. What happens now? I asked, still processing our partial victory. Now we meet the Historical Society team at Harrington House and make the most of your temporary access. He checked his watch. They should be arriving within the hour. We need to... My phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unfamiliar number. Eleanor Reed? This is Daniel Westbrook from the State Historical Society. I believe you received my email about today's emergency assessment. Yes, Mr. Westbrook. I was just discussing it with my attorney. Good. My team and I are currently at Harrington House, but we're encountering some resistance from the current occupants. Your presence might help resolve the situation. I exchanged glances with Michael. We'll be there in 15 minutes. As we drove toward the estate, Michael outlined our objectives. The Historical Society's assessment is critical. They need to document everything: architectural elements, fixtures, furniture placement, the relationship between the house and its surroundings. The more comprehensively they can establish the property's historical significance, the stronger our position becomes. We arrived to find 2 official vehicles parked in the circular driveway of Harrington House. 4 individuals in professional attire stood on the front portico, engaged in what appeared to be a tense conversation with Uncle James. Moving trucks were positioned near the service entrance. Workers paused in their activities as if awaiting instructions. Daniel Westbrook turned as our car approached. He was younger than I had expected for the Society's director, perhaps early 40s, with a trim beard and the purposeful air of someone accustomed to navigating bureaucratic challenges. Ms. Reed? He greeted me as I approached. Thank you for coming. Mr. Harrington has some concerns about our presence here today. Uncle James's face tightened at the diplomatic understatement. These people arrived without proper notice, demanding access to private property under active legal dispute. We have proper authorization, Westbrook replied calmly, producing official documentation. And as I've explained, the potential historical significance of this property creates certain obligations regardless of current ownership disputes. I stepped forward, courthouse order in hand. Uncle James, Judge Hamilton has specifically ruled that I'm to be granted access to facilitate the Historical Society's assessment. The removal of items from the house has been halted by court order. His gaze turned glacial. How convenient that the Historical Society appears precisely when you need them. Not convenient, Mr. Harrington, Westbrook interjected smoothly. Necessity. We've been monitoring this property since your father first contacted us 3 years ago. Recent activities have simply accelerated our timeline. 3 years. My grandfather had been laying groundwork for preservation far longer than even I had realized. The discovery shouldn't have surprised me. He had always been methodical, planning several moves ahead like the chess player he was. Uncle James recognized defeat, at least for the moment. With rigid courtesy, he stepped aside to allow the assessment team entry. I'll be observing the entire process, he informed us, a clear warning that nothing would escape his attention. The Historical Society team consisted of Westbrook, an architectural historian named Dr. Abigail Chen, a preservation specialist, and a professional photographer. They moved through the house with practiced efficiency, documenting, measuring, and evaluating with minimal disruption. I accompanied them, providing context and history for features they found particularly significant: the hand-carved newel, posts depicting local wildlife, the original gasolier fixtures that had been converted to electricity in the 1920s, the custom tile work in the conservatory created by a renowned Boston ceramicist. Throughout the assessment, I was acutely aware of what was missing. Empty spaces on walls where paintings had hung, vacant corners where furniture had stood for generations. Even with Judge Hamilton's order, we had arrived too late to prevent some losses. Mrs. Bennet appeared occasionally, ostensibly performing her usual duties but positioning herself to overhear conversations. Once, when Uncle James was distracted by a call, she slipped me a folded note. "Inventory list in my pocket. We'll pass later." Dr. Chen proved particularly interested in the architectural integrity of the house. "The original floor plan remains largely unmodified," she observed, examining the flow between rooms. "That's increasingly rare in properties of this era. Most have been subdivided or modernized beyond recognition." "My great-great-grandfather designed the layout himself," I explained. "Each generation has respected his vision, while making only necessary updates to systems and infrastructure." "The preservation ethic runs deep in your family," Westbrook commented, making a note in his tablet. "In some branches," I replied, conscious of Uncle James hovering nearby. By late afternoon, the team had completed their interior assessment and moved to the grounds. The gardens, though somewhat neglected since my grandfather's death, retained their original design and many heritage plantings, including several varieties of roses that had been cultivated on the property since the 1880s. "The relationship between house and landscape is exceptionally well preserved," Dr. Chen noted as we walked the formal garden paths. "The sightlines from key windows to garden features, the progression of spaces, it's all intentional design that enhances the property's historical value." Westbrook nodded agreement. "Ms. Reed, based on our preliminary assessment, Harrington House appears to meet criteria for emergency preservation measures. I'll need to consult with my board, but I anticipate we'll proceed with expedited designation proceedings." The implications were significant. Such designation would place legal restrictions on how the property could be modified, effectively preventing the subdivision and development plans Uncle James and Lawrence had been exploring. "How quickly could such a designation take effect?" Michael asked, joining us after spending part of the afternoon on calls related to our case. "Given the clear historical significance and the documented threats to preservation, we could have preliminary protections in place within days, full designation within weeks," Westbrook replied. Uncle James, who had been maintaining a careful distance during the grounds assessment, suddenly approached. "Mr. Westbrook, before your agency makes any determinations, I believe you should be aware of certain legal considerations. The current ownership and management of this property remain under court review." Westbrook's expression remained professionally neutral. "We're aware of the ongoing legal proceedings, Mr. Harrington. However, historical designation is independent of ownership questions. Our concern is preserving significant cultural and architectural heritage, regardless of who holds the title." Uncle James's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I see. Then you should also know that maintaining this property in its current state represents a significant financial burden. Historical designation would severely limit options for economic sustainability. There are numerous financial incentives available for designated properties," Westbrook countered. "Tax benefits, grant opportunities, specialized loans for preservation projects. Many owners find designation financially advantageous in the long term." It was a polite but unmistakable rebuke of Uncle James's implied threat that preservation would be economically unfeasible. The exchange confirmed what I had long suspected. My uncle viewed Harrington House primarily as a financial asset, not as the irreplaceable historical treasure my grandfather had understood it to be. As the assessment team prepared to depart, Westbrook took me aside. "Your grandfather spoke highly of your preservation knowledge when we corresponded. I can see why he had such confidence in your ability to steward this property." The simple validation nearly undid my carefully maintained composure. "Thank you. Preserving Harrington House was his deepest wish. We'll do everything within our authority to honor that wish," he assured me. "Expect to hear from us very soon." After the Historical Society departed, Uncle James fixed me with a cold stare. "This isn't over, Eleanor. Not by a long shot." "I never thought it was," I replied evenly. "But it's no longer just between us. The historical significance of this house transcends family disputes. Family, he scoffed quietly. You speak of family while undermining everything I've worked for. The irony of his accusation was breathtaking. What you've worked for is dismantling our heritage for profit. What I'm fighting for is preserving it for future generations. I think grandfather would be clear about which of us truly values family. I expected anger, perhaps another threat. Instead, something unexpected flickered across his features. A moment of uncertainty, almost regret, quickly suppressed. Without another word, he turned and walked back toward the house, leaving me to wonder what complicated emotions might lie beneath his ruthless exterior. Michael joined me as I watched Uncle James disappear through the front door. That looked intense. Just the usual family warmth, I replied with grim humor. What happens now? Now we wait for the Historical Society's determination while preparing for the full hearing on the will contest. Today was a significant step forward, but not the final one. As we prepared to leave, Mrs. Bennet approached, ostensibly to retrieve a garden tool I had been examining. As she took it from me, she pressed a folded paper into my palm. The inventory, she murmured, and something else you should see. Back in my car, I unfolded the paper to find not only a detailed list of items removed from the house, but a handwritten note in an elegant, familiar script, my grandfather's handwriting. To whom it may concern, should any question arise regarding my intentions for Harrington House, let it be known that I, William James Harrington, being of sound mind, have designated my granddaughter, Eleanor Elizabeth Reed, as trustee and preservation director. This appointment reflects both her professional qualifications and her demonstrated commitment to our family's heritage. Any challenge to this designation represents a direct contravention of my wishes. William J. Harrington, dated March 12th. The note had been written just 2 weeks before his death. Its timing and phrasing suggested he had anticipated the very challenges now unfolding. Once again, my grandfather had planned ahead, leaving additional evidence of his intentions. I handed the note to Michael, who studied it with growing excitement. This is extremely valuable, a clear, recent statement of intent in his own handwriting. Combined with the Historical Society's assessment, we're building an overwhelming case. As we drove away from Harrington House, I felt a complex mixture of emotions, hope tempered by awareness of the battles still ahead, satisfaction at the day's progress shadowed by sadness at the family rift that seemed to widen with each confrontation. Yet, beneath these conflicting feelings ran a current of certainty. For the first time since my grandfather's death, I believed his wishes would ultimately prevail. The house he had loved, the legacy he had entrusted to me, would be preserved, not just for our family, but for history itself. What I couldn't yet imagine was how dramatically events would accelerate in the days ahead, or how an unexpected discovery would transform not just the legal battle, but my understanding of the Harrington family itself. 2 days after the Historical Society's assessment, I received an early morning call from Daniel Westbrook. Ms. Reed, our board met in an emergency session last night. Based on our team's findings and the documented threats to the property, we've initiated emergency preservation designation for Harrington House. I sat up straighter in my mother's kitchen, nearly spilling my coffee. That's wonderful news. What exactly does emergency designation mean in practical terms? It creates immediate legal protections against substantive alterations to the property's architectural features and historically significant elements. Any removal of original fixtures, modifications to structure, or changes to the grounds would require society approval. His voice took on a more formal tone, clearly reciting official language. Additionally, the designation triggers automatic review by state authorities of any proposed development or subdivision plans. In other words, Uncle James and Lawrence couldn't proceed with their condominium scheme while the designation remained in effect. How long does emergency designation last? I asked, already anticipating my uncle's countermoves. Initially, 90 days. During that period, we'll complete the full application process for permanent designation. Given what we've documented, I anticipate approval will be forthcoming. This was the protection we had hoped for, not just temporary intervention, but a path to permanent preservation of Harrington House as my grandfather had envisioned. There's something else, Westbrook continued, his tone shifting slightly. During our research into the property's history, we discovered documentation that may have significance beyond architectural preservation. Are you familiar with the original proprietors' agreement of 1873? The question caught me off guard. Vaguely. It was the founding document for Mapleton Township, wasn't it? I believe my great-great-grandfather was one of the signatories. Precisely. Thomas Harrington was one of 7 original proprietors who established the township and allocated the initial land grants. What's particularly interesting is a clause in that agreement regarding preservation rights for founding properties. Preservation. Rights, I echoed, unfamiliar with the term in this context. It's quite unusual, essentially a 19th-century version of a preservation easement. The clause stipulates that descendants of original proprietors retain specific preservation authority over founding homesteads, independent of current ownership. My mind raced to process the implications. Are you saying that as a Harrington descendant, I have some kind of legal authority over the property even if I don't own it? Not just any descendant, Westbrook clarified. The agreement specifies the direct lineal descendant who bears the family name or who has demonstrated commitment to preservation of historical legacy. You're in a unique position, Ms. Reed. Your professional background in preservation, combined with your direct lineage, appears to qualify you specifically under this clause. The revelation was stunning. My grandfather must have known about this provision. It would explain his confidence in naming me trustee despite knowing his son would object. It wasn't just sentiment or recognition of my professional qualifications. He was activating a legal right that had existed for nearly 150 years. Why hasn't this come up before? I asked, struggling to absorb the implications. The agreement has been essentially dormant for generations. Most founding families sold their properties long ago or developed them beyond recognition. Harrington House is one of only 2 original proprietor homesteads still intact and in family hands. We discovered the clause while researching historical precedents for your property's designation. Does my uncle know about this? Not from us, Westbrook replied. We've only just confirmed the clause's applicability, but the agreement is public. Record accessible to anyone researching property law in Mapleton. Whether Mr. Harrington is aware of it? He left the sentence unfinished. After we hung up, I immediately called Michael to share this unexpected development. His reaction mirrored my own initial disbelief. An 1873 agreement with a preservation clause? He marveled. That's extraordinary and potentially game-changing for our case. If it's enforceable, I cautioned, laws and agreements from the 19th century don't always translate to modern legal practice. True, but Massachusetts has some of the strongest historical preservation precedents in the country. I need to see the exact language of this agreement. If it's as Westbrook described, we may have just discovered the key to securing your position regardless of the will contest. While Michael began researching the original proprietor's agreement, I focused on documenting the changes already made to Harrington House. Using Mrs. Bennett's inventory list, I created a comprehensive catalog of removed items, including photographs, where available, and notes on historical significance. The process was painful, highlighting how much had already been lost. Family portraits dating back generations. The Chippendale secretary desk where my grandfather had written correspondence. The hand-knotted Persian carpets that had graced the formal rooms since the 1890s. Each item represented not just monetary value, but historical context that enhanced the meaning of Harrington House itself. Late that afternoon, I received an unexpected text from Meredith. We need to talk, not at the house. Maxwell's Cafe at 7? I hesitated, wary of traps after recent events. but curiosity won out. I texted back a simple, "I'll be there," and spent the next few hours wondering what had prompted this outreach. Maxwell's was a quiet establishment on the edge of Mapleton's historic district, far enough from the town center to avoid casual encounters with my uncle's social circle. Meredith was already seated in a back booth when I arrived, a half-empty glass of white wine before her. She looked tired, the careful makeup not quite concealing the strain around her eyes. "Thank you for coming," she said as I slid into the booth across from her. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," I admitted. "Recent family interactions haven't exactly inspired trust." She winced slightly. "Fair enough. I've ordered a bottle." She gestured to the wine. "But I can get you something else if you prefer." I shook my head. "This is fine." "Why are we here, Meredith?" She took a slow sip before answering. "Things have gotten out of hand. Dad and Lawrence they're not thinking clearly anymore. It's become some kind of bizarre crusade against you, against grandfather's wishes. I needed to talk to someone who remembers what family is supposed to mean." The vulnerability in her voice seemed genuine, though years of Harrington family dynamics had taught me caution. "I'm listening." "Dad received notification of the emergency preservation designation this morning. He was furious. I've never seen him like that. He called Lawrence, and they spent hours with Ms. Whitfield strategizing countermoves." She twisted her napkin nervously. "Then this afternoon, Dad received another document, something about original proprietors and preservation rights. That's when he truly lost it." So Uncle James did know about the 1873 agreement. The timing suggested he'd discovered it independently, perhaps through his own legal research. He kept saying it was impossible, that no one could have known about that clause, that grandfather must have orchestrated this whole situation. Meredith's voice dropped. "Ellie, he's talking about challenging grandfather's competency retrospectively, claiming he was manipulated for years, not just at the end." The accusation was both absurd and deeply offensive. My grandfather had been sharp until his final days, his decisions deliberate and well-considered. "That won't stand up legally," I said, more confidently than I felt. "There's too much evidence of his mental clarity." "This isn't just legal anymore," Meredith replied, eyes meeting mine directly. "Dad is obsessed. He's convinced grandfather betrayed the family by choosing you over Lawrence. He's determined to undo that decision whatever it takes. And Lawrence," her expression darkened, "Lawrence is encouraging him. He sees himself as defending the Harrington legacy, though his only real interest is in what he can sell off." I studied my cousin, trying to understand her position in this family drama. "Why are you telling me this, Meredith? Where do you stand?" She was silent for a long moment, staring into her wine as if it might offer guidance. "I love my family," she said finally, "but I'm ashamed of what they're doing. Grandfather trusted you with Harrington House because you understand its value, beyond dollars and cents. You see what it really is, a living connection to our past." "I didn't expect this from you," I admitted. "You've never seemed particularly interested in the house or its history." "Because I never needed to be," she replied simply. "Grandfather was there, preserving everything, maintaining traditions. It was easy to take it for granted." She paused, swirling the wine in her glass. "But watching Dad and Lawrence talk about subdividing the property, selling off heirlooms piece by piece, it made me realize how much I care about what that house represents." Her words rang true, matching my own evolving relationship with the Harrington legacy. Perhaps we were more alike than either of us had recognized. "There's something else you should know," Meredith continued, lowering her voice further. "Dad has been meeting with Judge Hamilton socially. Golf games, dinners. They're old friends from college. That's how he got the conservatorship so easily." The revelation confirmed our suspicions about Judge Hamilton's bias, but didn't surprise me. Mapleton's elite had always operated through networks of influence and obligation. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "It helps explain some things." Meredith hesitated, then reached into her purse and withdrew a small velvet pouch. "I took this before Lawrence could find it," she explained, sliding it across the table. "Grandmother's journal from the year grandfather transformed the East Gardens. She documented everything, the heritage plantings, the restoration of the original pathways. I thought it might help with the historical designation." I opened the pouch carefully, finding a leather-bound volume filled with Charlotte Harrington's elegant handwriting and meticulous sketches of garden layouts. It was exactly the kind of documentation that would strengthen the preservation case, detailed, authentic historical records of the property's development. "This is incredibly valuable," I told her, genuinely moved by the gesture. "But why risk getting involved? Won't your father be furious if he discovers you've helped me?" Meredith offered a sad smile. "Probably. But some things matter more than avoiding conflict. Grandfather understood that. It's why he made the choices he did, knowing they would cause tension." She straightened her shoulders slightly. "Besides, I'm 32 years old. It's time I formed my own judgments instead of automatically accepting my father's." As we talked further, a new picture of Meredith emerged. Someone who had been quietly observing family dynamics from within, forming her own conclusions while outwardly conforming to expectations. Her independent life in Boston, I realized, had been her way of establishing distance without triggering the kind of confrontation I had faced through my more direct challenges to family norms. "What will you do now?" I asked as our conversation wound down. "This puts you in a difficult position." "I'm going back to Boston tomorrow," she replied. "I've told Dad I need to focus on work for a while. It's not untrue. My job doesn't allow for extended family drama, but mostly I need space to think through what happens next." She met my gaze directly. "Whatever I decide, I want you to know you're not alone in believing grandfather made the right choice." We parted with a surprising sense of connection, this unexpected alliance adding yet another layer to the complex family dynamics surrounding Harrington House. The following morning, I met with Michael to review his findings on the original proprietor's agreement. He spread photocopied documents across my mother's kitchen table, his excitement palpable. "It's even more significant than Westbrook indicated," he explained, highlighting key passages. "The agreement doesn't just establish preservation rights. It creates what legal historians call a perpetual stewardship obligation that runs with the land regardless of ownership changes." Meaning what, exactly? Meaning that even if your uncle successfully challenges the will and trust, even if he gains legal title to Harrington House, the preservation rights established in 1873 would remain with the qualifying descendant, which is you, based on both lineage and professional qualifications. The implications were stunning. So, regardless of who owns the property on paper, you would retain authority over preservation decisions, Michael confirmed, including prevention of development, subdivision, or significant alterations. It's essentially a historical preservation veto power, established nearly 150 years ago but still legally binding. No wonder Uncle James had been so disturbed by the discovery. The agreement potentially neutralized his primary objective, monetizing the property through development or subdivision. "Will this hold up in court?" I asked, not daring to fully embrace the hope his discovery offered. "I believe it will. Massachusetts courts have consistently upheld historical covenants when they're clearly documented and serve a public good. Preservation of founding homesteads certainly qualifies." He gathered the papers into a folder. "I've scheduled a meeting with Judge Peterson, a different judge than Hamilton, to present this evidence and request formal recognition of your preservation rights under the agreement." "What about the will contest and conservatorship?" "Those proceedings continue, but with diminished significance. Even if your uncle prevails in those matters, the 1873 agreement would prevent him from implementing the changes he's planning." For the first time since being locked out of Harrington House, I felt the tide turning decisively in our favor. My grandfather's foresight, combined with the unexpected historical protection from my great-great-grandfather's era, had created a legal fortress around his preservation intentions. That afternoon, I received another call from Daniel Westbrook. Ms. Reed, our research team has uncovered additional historical documentation relevant to Harrington House. Would you be available to review these materials at our office tomorrow morning? Of course, I agreed, curious about this new development. May I ask what kind of documentation? Original architectural drawings, correspondence between Thomas Harrington and the master craftsman who built the house, and most interestingly, a covenant specifically addressing the carved elements and wood features. It appears your great-great-grandfather was quite determined to ensure these elements would be preserved in perpetuity. Another layer of protection, another testament to the Harrington family's historical commitment to preservation. A commitment that had skipped Uncle James's generation but resurfaced in mine. There's one more thing, Westbrook added. We've located what appears to be a hidden room not included in the modern floor plans of Harrington House. The original blueprints show a small chamber accessible through the library, but subsequent renovations seem to have obscured the entrance. Given the current situation, we believe it might be prudent to investigate whether this space contains additional historical artifacts or documentation. A hidden room. The concept seemed almost theatrical, yet entirely plausible in a house with Harrington House's complex history. Old homes often contained sealed spaces, repurposed during renovations or deliberately concealed for reasons long forgotten. How would we access this room? I asked, already imagining what historical treasures might lie beyond a hidden door. That's the challenge. Without destructive investigation, which we obviously want to avoid, we'd need someone intimately familiar with the house's architecture. I was hoping you might have insights, given your family connection and preservation background. My mind immediately went to my grandfather's stories about the house's secret places. Features I had always assumed were meant to entertain a fascinated child rather than literal descriptions. But what if those stories had contained factual information disguised as fanciful tales? I might have some ideas, I told Westbrook. Let me review the original blueprints first, then compare them with my own knowledge of the house. As I hung up, my thoughts raced with possibilities. A hidden room could contain anything. Family documents, historical artifacts, perhaps even evidence that would strengthen our legal position further. Whatever it held, the discovery represented yet another way that Harrington House continued to protect its own legacy and mine. The next morning would bring new revelations, new challenges, and an unexpected confrontation that would test not just my legal position, but my understanding of what family truly means. The State Historical Society's offices occupied a dignified federal-style building near the Mapleton Town Commons. Originally a merchant's home built in the early 1800s, it had been meticulously restored to serve as both administrative headquarters and research center for the region's historical preservation efforts. I arrived promptly at 9, clutching my grandmother's garden journal and several notebooks containing childhood memories of my grandfather's stories about the house. The receptionist directed me to a conference room where Daniel Westbrook waited with Dr. Chen and an elderly gentleman I hadn't met during the property assessment. Ms. Reed, thank you for coming, Westbrook greeted me. Allow me to introduce Professor Emmett Sullivan, our consulting architectural historian specializing in 19th century New England residential construction. Professor Sullivan half rose from his chair, extending a gnarled hand. A pleasure, my dear. I've been studying homes like Harrington House for longer than you've been alive. His eyes twinkled behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Though I must say, few have preserved their original features so completely. That's my grandfather's doing, I explained, shaking his hand. He was fanatical about maintaining historical accuracy, even when updating systems or making repairs. A man after my own heart, Sullivan nodded approvingly. Now, let's examine these blueprints, shall we? Spread across the conference table were the original architectural drawings for Harrington House, yellowed with age but remarkably detailed. Beside them lay modern floor plans created during a renovation in the 1980s, providing a visual comparison of how the house had evolved over more than a century. Professor Sullivan guided my attention to the library section. Notice the discrepancy here, he said, pointing to an area where the two plans diverged. The original design shows a small room adjacent to the library's northeast corner, approximately 8 feet by 10 feet. In the modern plans, this space appears to have been absorbed into the thickness of the walls, or perhaps eliminated entirely. I studied the area he indicated, memory stirring. The portrait wall, I murmured. Pardon? Dr. Chen looked up from her notes. In the library, the northeast wall is covered with family portraits, Harringtons from every generation. It's one of the few walls in the house without windows or built-in bookshelves, which always seemed odd in a room otherwise designed to maximize natural light and storage. Professor Sullivan's eyes lit with scholarly excitement. A perfect hiding place. The portraits would discourage any casual investigation of the wall itself. I closed my eyes, picturing the library with its rich walnut paneling and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. The portrait wall had always felt different somehow, though I'd never questioned why. My grandfather had often sat in the leather armchair beside it, reading or simply contemplating the family images that surrounded him. My grandfather used to tell me stories about the house that remembers, I said slowly, opening my eyes. He claimed Harrington House had ways of protecting its treasures, keeping secrets safe until the right time. I always thought he was spinning tales to entertain a child, but perhaps he was preparing you, Westbrook finished, leaning forward with interest. Passing on knowledge indirectly. I nodded, continuing to search my memories. There was one story he told repeatedly, about Thomas Harrington hiding valuables during a colonial tax dispute. According to the tale, he created a space behind the faces of those who came before, accessible only if you knew where to press. Dr. Chen exchanged meaningful glances with her colleagues. That sounds remarkably specific for a children's story. Behind. The faces of those who came before, Professor Sullivan repeated thoughtfully. The portrait wall. And where to press. Potentially a pressure mechanism that triggers a hidden door or panel. Can you recall which portrait he mentioned most? Often in these stories? Westbrook asked. I concentrated, trying to resurrect details from childhood memories. He would sit in his chair, gesturing toward the portraits as he spoke. His favorite was the one of Elizabeth Harrington, his great-grandmother. He said she had watchful eyes that saw everything, and that she was the guardian of family secrets. Professor. Sullivan made a note. A spring mechanism potentially concealed behind or within this specific portrait, perhaps. Such devices were not uncommon in homes of prominent families during the 19th century. The question is how to investigate without damaging the property or alerting the current occupants, Dr. Chen pointed out. Under the emergency designation, we have authority to document historical features but not to conduct invasive exploration. Westbrook considered this challenge. We could request formal access for a more detailed assessment, citing the original blueprints as justification. But that would telegraph our interest in this specific area. I thought of Mrs. Bennett, still working inside Harrington House and sympathetic to our cause. I might have another way, I suggested. Someone who could examine the portrait wall without raising suspicions. While the historians continued analyzing the blueprints, I stepped out to call Mrs. Bennett. She answered in a hushed voice. Miss Ellie, I can't talk long. Mr. James is meeting with contractors in the dining room. Contractors? My concern spiked, but I focused on the immediate issue. Mrs. Bennett, I need your help with something in the library. The portrait wall. I have reason to believe there might be a hidden room behind it. The northeast wall? With Miss Elizabeth's portrait? The lack of surprise in her voice caught my attention. You know about it? A brief hesitation. Your grandfather never showed me directly, but I've suspected. He spent hours in that library, and sometimes I'd return to find furniture slightly moved, though nothing else appeared disturbed. Hope surged through me. Can you examine the wall carefully? Look for anything unusual about Elizabeth's portrait. A frame that protrudes differently than the others, perhaps, or some kind of mechanism. I'll try, but I'll need a reason to spend time in the library. Mr. James has restricted my duties. To essential cleaning only, I thought quickly. Tell him you noticed potential moisture damage near the northeast corner. Preservation of the books would be a legitimate concern. Clever, Miss Ellie. I'll call you when I can. Returning to the conference room, I found the team now focused on letters between Thomas Harrington and the craftsman who had built the house. One passage in particular had caught their attention. The special compartment has been constructed. As directed, Westbrook read aloud, with the mechanism installed behind the lady's likeness as requested. Only those who know to seek the latch beneath the frame will discover what lies within. Professor Sullivan nodded with satisfaction. There's our confirmation. A hidden latch beneath the portrait frame, likely Elizabeth Harrington's image, based on your recollection. The question remains, what did Thomas Harrington consider important enough to conceal this way? Dr. Chen mused. And why has the room remained hidden through successive generations? Family documents, perhaps, I suggested. Thomas was a shipping merchant during a period when business practices weren't always strictly documented. The room might have originally concealed financial records. Or something of historical significance beyond family matters, Westbrook added. The timing is interesting. The house was built shortly after the Civil War, during Reconstruction. Many prominent New England families had complicated relationships with both sides of the conflict. Professor Sullivan offered another perspective. Hidden spaces often served multiple purposes across generations. What began as a merchant's private document storage might later become a family archive, then perhaps a secure location for valuables during uncertain times. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from Michael. I excused myself to answer. We have a hearing scheduled with Judge Peterson tomorrow morning, he informed me without preamble. I've filed for formal recognition of your preservation rights. Under the 1873 agreement, your uncle's attorney has already submitted opposing arguments, but from my review, they're on shaky legal ground. That's excellent news, I replied, relieved that our case would be heard by someone other than Judge Hamilton. There's another development you should know about. Before I could explain about the hidden room, Michael interrupted with urgency in his voice. Ellie, I've just received a concerning report. A demolition permit application was submitted this morning for interior modifications at Harrington House. Your uncle is moving quickly. My blood ran cold. What kind of modifications? The permit is deliberately vague. Non-structural interior renovations to modernize outdated features. But given what we know of his intentions, he's trying to destroy historical elements before the preservation designation becomes permanent, I realized, sick at the thought. Can we stop him? I'm filing an immediate injunction based on the emergency designation, but these things take time to process. There's a risk he could begin work before the court intervenes. The contractors Mrs. Bennett had mentioned, they weren't there for assessment, but for immediate action. I had to warn Westbrook. Michael, I need to go. The Historical Society team needs to know about this immediately. When I explained the situation, Westbrook's reaction was swift. This changes our timeline. We need to document that hidden room, now, before any demolition begins. I can't legally enter the house without permission, I reminded him, frustrated by the constraints of the court order. But I can, Westbrook countered. The emergency designation gives me authority to inspect the property to ensure compliance with preservation requirements. I'll go immediately, citing concerns about the demolition permit. I'll accompany you, Professor Sullivan declared, gathering his notes. My expertise may prove useful if we locate the hidden room. And I'll coordinate with the State Preservation Office to expedite the injunction against demolition, Dr. Chen added, already reaching for her phone. Within 30 minutes, we had mobilized. I couldn't directly participate in the inspection, but I could provide remote guidance. We established a video call connection so I could view the library through Westbrook's phone camera and offer suggestions based on my knowledge of the house. I waited anxiously in the Historical Society offices, watching as Westbrook and Professor Sullivan arrived at Harrington House. The reception was predictably frosty. Uncle James appeared briefly on camera, his expression tight with barely controlled anger as Westbrook presented the official inspection authorization. "This is harassment," he objected, though he stopped short of denying access. "These constant interventions in private property matters are completely inappropriate. The emergency designation created specific legal obligations, Mr. Harrington." Westbrook replied calmly, "Your demolition permit application necessitates immediate review to ensure compliance with preservation requirements." Uncle James eventually retreated, allowing the inspection to proceed while he made agitated phone calls from his study. The contractors he had engaged waited awkwardly in the foyer, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden official scrutiny. When Westbrook and Professor Sullivan reached the library, the video feed showed me the familiar space. Tall bookshelves, leather chairs, the massive oak desk where my grandfather had written countless letters. And there on the northeast wall hung the portrait gallery, generations of Harringtons gazing sternly from gilt frames. "Elizabeth's portrait is third from the left on the top row," I directed, peering at the screen. "It's smaller than the others. She's shown seated with a book in her lap." The camera panned across the wall until it focused on the painting in question. Elizabeth Harrington had been a formidable woman by all accounts, instrumental in establishing Mapleton's first public library, and known for her progressive views on women's education. The portrait captured her intense gaze and the subtle determination in her posture. "Notice anything unusual about the frame?" Professor Sullivan asked, examining it closely. "It appears to protrude slightly more than the others," Westbrook observed, "and the bottom edge seems to have a different finish, almost as if it's been handled more frequently." The letter mentioned a latch beneath the frame, I reminded them. "Can you check if the bottom rail is movable?" Professor Sullivan's gnarled fingers carefully explored the underside of the frame, moving gradually from one end to the other. About 2/3 of the way across, something clicked audibly. "Aha!" he exclaimed softly. "A spring mechanism just as we suspected." On my screen, I could see nothing had visibly changed. "What happened?" "Nothing apparent," Westbrook replied, scanning the wall. "The portrait didn't move, and I don't see any opening." "Perhaps it's a two-step mechanism," Professor Sullivan suggested. "Victorian hidden doors often required multiple actions to prevent accidental discovery." I racked my brain for additional clues from my grandfather's stories. "Press where time stands still," I recalled suddenly. That was another phrase he used in his tales. When you find where time stands still, the path forward appears. The camera panned across the library as they considered this cryptic instruction. It was Professor Sullivan who made the connection. "The mantel clock," he said, pointing to an ornate timepiece centered above the fireplace opposite the portrait wall. "It's not running, time standing still, quite literally." Westbrook moved to examine the clock, a magnificent piece with a carved walnut case and brass fittings. "It appears to be maintained but deliberately not wound. The hands are fixed at exactly 3:47. 3:47, I repeated, the numbers triggering another memory. The family history mentions 1847 as the year Thomas Harrington established his shipping business. Could that be significant? A numerical code, perhaps? Professor Sullivan approached the clock, carefully examining its face and case. Many hidden mechanisms from this period involved pressure points corresponding to significant numbers. After several minutes of exploration, They discovered that pressing simultaneously on the 3 and 7 positions on the clock face caused something to shift. A soft rumbling sound came from the direction of the portrait wall. The camera swung back to reveal a remarkable sight. The section of wall containing Elizabeth's portrait had recessed slightly and slid sideways, revealing a narrow opening approximately 3 feet wide. Extraordinary, Professor Sullivan breathed, his scholarly reserve momentarily abandoned. A perfectly preserved hidden entrance, operational after nearly 150 years. Westbrook directed his phone's flashlight into the opening, illuminating a small room exactly as indicated in the original blueprints. Wooden shelves lined the walls, holding leather-bound ledgers, document boxes, and what appeared to be rolled architectural plans. A small desk stood against one wall, its surface covered with yellowed papers weighted down by a brass paperweight shaped like a sailing ship. "It appears to be an intact private study or document repository," Westbrook narrated, "for my benefit. Undisturbed for decades, judging by the dust patterns. Can you see what's in those document boxes?" I asked, my voice tight with anticipation. Westbrook carefully examined the nearest shelf. Most are labeled with dates and cryptic notations. Here's one marked Proprietor's Agreement, enforcement provisions that looks promising. His camera focused on a leather document case embossed with the Harrington family crest. "With your permission, I'd like to examine the contents. As historical artifacts potentially relevant to the property's designation, they fall within our assessment authority." "Please do," I urged, barely able to contain my excitement. As Westbrook carefully opened the case, footsteps sounded in the library doorway. The camera jerked up to reveal Uncle James standing there, his face a mask of shock as he registered the open wall and exposed the hidden room. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, striding forward. "You have no right to break into private spaces. In my home." "We haven't broken anything, Mr. Harrington," Westbrook replied calmly. "We've discovered an original architectural feature documented in your home's blueprints. As preservation specialists conducting an authorized assessment, we're obligated to document all historical elements." Uncle James peered into the hidden room, momentarily forgetting his outrage as curiosity took over. "I had no idea this existed," he murmured, then caught himself. "Nevertheless, any documents contained within are private family property and not subject to your inspection." Professor Sullivan cleared his throat. "Actually, sir, historical documents directly related to the property's original construction and legal standing fall within the scope of our assessment authority under Section 12 of the Massachusetts Historical Preservation Act." While they debated the legal nuances, I noticed Westbrook had managed to extract several documents from the case and was discreetly photographing them with his phone. One appeared to be an original signed copy of the proprietor's agreement, complete, with wax seals and witnessing signatures. The video suddenly jarred as Uncle James noticed this documentation process. "Stop that immediately," he demanded, reaching for Westbrook's phone. The feed became chaotic, voices overlapping as Professor Sullivan objected to interference with official proceedings, and Westbrook attempted to maintain professional composure. Through the confusion, I glimpsed additional faces appearing in the library doorway. Lawrence, looking thunderstruck at the revealed hidden room, and surprisingly, Meredith, who must have returned from Boston. "Historical discovery of significant importance," Professor Sullivan was saying. "My father's house, my family's private property," Uncle James countered. "Legal obligation to document," Westbrook insisted. The video call abruptly ended, leaving me staring at a blank screen, my heart pounding with a mixture of triumph and concern. We had discovered the hidden room and confirmed the existence of crucial historical documents. But now, Uncle James was fully aware of what we had found, and his reaction suggested he understood its potential impact on his plans for Harrington House. I immediately called Michael to update him on this dramatic development, pacing the historical society conference room as I explained what had transpired. "This could be exactly what we need," he said when I finished. If those documents include original copies of the proprietor's agreement with specific preservation provisions, they'll be nearly impossible to challenge legally. The court gives tremendous weight to contemporaneous documentation of intent. Assuming Westbrook managed to preserve the evidence before Uncle James intervened, I worried. Even if he didn't get everything, finding the hidden room itself is significant. It demonstrates your grandfather wasn't the first Harrington concerned with preservation. It's a family tradition dating back generations. As we discussed next steps, my phone chimed with an incoming text from an unknown number. The message contained several photographs, clear images of the documents Westbrook had managed to capture before the confrontation. The accompanying text read simply, "Thought you might need these. Preservation matters. M. Meredith." My cousin had once again chosen to support preservation over family loyalty, this time even more directly. I forwarded the images to Michael, hope rising. The century-and-a-half-old agreement that might protect Harrington House from development was no longer just a reference in legal archives. We now had photographic evidence of the original document, discovered in a hidden room that Thomas Harrington himself had created to protect family secrets. Tomorrow's hearing with Judge Peterson suddenly seemed far more promising. The question was whether Uncle James recognized the significance of what had been discovered, and what desperate measures he might take before legal processes could unfold. The morning of our hearing with Judge Peterson dawned clear and crisp, autumn light casting long shadows across Mapleton's historic district as I made my way to the courthouse. Unlike my previous court appearance, today I walked with confidence. Michael at my side, and a portfolio containing evidence that had quite literally emerged from behind the walls of history. A small crowd had gathered outside the courthouse, an unusual sight for what should have been a routine property matter. As we approached, I recognized several preservation advocates from neighboring communities, along with local reporters and curious townspeople. News of the hidden room discovery had apparently spread quickly through Mapleton's gossip networks. The Historical Society must have publicized the finding, Michael observed, nodding toward Daniel Westbrook, who stood speaking with a reporter. Smart move. Public interest creates additional pressure for preservation. Inside, the assigned courtroom was nearly full. Uncle James and Ms. Whitfield sat at their table, heads bent in urgent conversation. Lawrence slouched beside them, looking unusually subdued. When the door opened again behind us, I turned to see Meredith slip quietly into a back row seat, making eye contact briefly before focusing on her phone. Judge Peterson entered promptly at 9, a sharp contrast to Judge Hamilton's deliberate delays. Where Hamilton had been imposing and traditional, Peterson was compact, efficient, and considerably younger, perhaps early 50s, with intelligent eyes that suggested little escaped her notice. This hearing concerns preservation rights under the 1873 Proprietors' Agreement as they relate to Harrington House, she began, scanning the documents before her. I've reviewed the submissions from both parties, as well as the supporting historical documentation. Let's begin with Mr. Sanderson presenting the case for recognition of Ms. Reed's preservation rights. Michael approached the matter methodically, outlining the original agreement, explaining how its preservation clause had remained dormant yet legally binding, and demonstrating how I qualified as the designated preservation steward, based on both lineage and professional credentials. Your Honor, the intent of the original signatories is unambiguous, he concluded. They sought to ensure their founding homesteads would be preserved for future generations, regardless of ownership changes or family disputes. The recent discovery of the hidden archive room at Harrington House provides additional contemporary evidence of this intent. Judge Peterson turned to Ms. Whitfield. Counsel for the Harrington family, your response? Ms. Whitfield adjusted her glasses with a practiced gesture. Your Honor, while we acknowledge the historical interest of these recently discovered documents, their legal relevance to modern property rights is tenuous at best. The 1873 agreement predates modern property law by generations. Its provisions should be viewed as aspirational rather than legally binding in today's context. She continued with arguments about changed circumstances, unreasonable restrictions on property rights, and the doctrine of laches, essentially suggesting that the preservation clause had been abandoned through decades of non-enforcement. Throughout her presentation, Uncle James nodded in agreement, his expression confident. When both sides had presented their initial arguments, Judge Peterson posed a series of penetrating questions that suggested she had thoroughly researched the legal precedents involving historical preservation covenants. Her inquiries revealed a sophisticated understanding of both property law and preservation principles. "Mr. Harrington," she addressed my uncle directly, "if I understand correctly, your objection isn't to preservation of the property per se, but to the authority being vested in Ms. Reed rather than yourself as the presumptive owner." Uncle James straightened in his chair. "Your Honor, my concern is with allowing a junior family member with limited connection to the property to dictate its management. The Harrington family has maintained this estate for generations without outside interference. Yet the demolition permit application your contractors submitted last week suggests substantial alterations are planned," Judge Peterson noted, her tone neutral but pointed. Uncle James shifted uncomfortably. "Modernization is necessary for any historic home to remain functional. The core historical features would be preserved. According to the architectural assessment submitted by the Historical Society, the planned demolition would remove several original architectural elements, including the hand-carved staircase, original wood paneling, and built-in cabinetry dating to the initial construction. Would you characterize these as core historical features?" His hesitation was brief but telling. "Those elements require extensive maintenance and repair. The cost-benefit analysis is precisely what preservation easements are designed to address," Judge Peterson finished for him. "The balance between modernization and historical integrity." The questioning continued for another hour, with Judge Peterson demonstrating remarkable familiarity with both the specific details of Harrington House and the broader legal principles at stake. By the time she called a brief recess to review final documents, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted perceptibly. Uncle James's confident demeanor had given way to tension, while Lawrence had abandoned any pretense of interest, slumped in his chair scrolling through his phone. When Judge Peterson returned to the bench, her decision was decisive. "Having reviewed the evidence and arguments presented, I find the preservation provisions of the 1873 Proprietors' Agreement remain legally binding. The intent of the original signatories is clear and consistent with Massachusetts' strong public policy favoring historical preservation." She continued, outlining specific findings that validated my role as the designated preservation authority under the agreement's terms. Ms. Reed's direct lineage, combined with her professional qualifications in historical preservation, satisfy the agreement's requirement for a direct lineal descendant who has demonstrated commitment to preservation of historical legacy. The legal implications unfolded clearly. While questions of ownership through inheritance remained subject to separate proceedings, my authority over preservation decisions was now formally recognized by the court. Any alterations, renovations, or changes to historically significant features of Harrington House would require my approval, regardless of who held the property title. "The demolition permit application is hereby invalidated," Judge Peterson concluded, "and an injunction is issued preventing any structural modifications to Harrington House without explicit authorization from Ms. Reed in her capacity as preservation trustee." The ruling was more comprehensive than we had dared hope for. Not only had the judge recognized my preservation rights, but she had effectively neutralized Uncle James's ability to implement his development plans, even if he ultimately prevailed in the will contest. As the courtroom began to empty, I caught Meredith's eye across the room. She offered a small smile and a subtle nod before slipping out a side door, careful to avoid her father and brother. Her quiet support throughout this process had been an unexpected gift. a reminder that family connections could transcend immediate conflicts. Uncle James remained seated, conferring intensely with Ms. Whitfield. Their expressions suggested they were already strategizing potential appeals or workarounds. Lawrence had vanished immediately after the ruling, unwilling to face the outcome of a battle he had helped instigate but couldn't win. Outside the courthouse, Daniel Westbrook approached Professor Sullivan and Dr. Chen. "Congratulations, Ms. Reed. This ruling creates an important precedent for historical preservation throughout Massachusetts. We couldn't have done it without your team's discovery of the hidden room," I acknowledged. That physical evidence of Thomas Harrington's commitment to preservation was invaluable. Professor Sullivan's eyes twinkled behind his spectacles. "The house protected itself, in a manner of speaking. Your great-great-grandfather created that hidden archive knowing someday its contents might be needed." Michael joined us, tucking his legal pad into his briefcase. "The ruling on preservation rights significantly strengthens our position in the broader inheritance case. Judge Peterson's findings directly support your grandfather's intentions in naming you trustee." Our small celebration was interrupted by Uncle James emerging from the courthouse, Ms. Whitfield at his side. He hesitated when he saw our group, clearly debating whether to walk past without acknowledgement. After a moment's consideration, he approached, his expression rigidly controlled. "Eleanor, Mr. Westbrook." He nodded stiffly. "I imagine you're quite pleased with yourselves." "This isn't about winning or losing, Uncle James," I replied, keeping my tone measured. "It's about honoring grandfather's wishes and preserving our family's legacy." "Legacy," he repeated, the word bitter on his tongue. "You talk of legacy while preventing the family from realizing the property's actual value." "The value isn't just monetary," I countered. "Harrington House represents 7 generations of family history, community contribution, and architectural significance. That's what grandfather understood, what Thomas Harrington understood when he built that hidden room to protect the family's historical documents." Something shifted in Uncle James's expression, not softening exactly, but a momentary crack in his rigid certainty. "You sound like him. My father. Always talking about responsibility to history to future generations." He shook his head. "He never understood the financial burdens of maintaining that mausoleum of a house." "Perhaps he understood better than you realize," I suggested. "The trust he established includes an endowment specifically for maintenance and preservation." He wasn't being impractical, he was being thorough. This seemed to catch him off guard. "Endowment? What endowment?" "Nearly $2 million set aside purely for preservation and maintenance costs," Michael confirmed. "Your father restructured several investments in his final years specifically to create this fund. It's detailed in the trust documentation." "Uncle?" James turned to Ms. Whitfield, who nodded reluctantly, confirming this detail had indeed been in the paperwork they'd received. This revelation clearly undercut his narrative of impractical preservation burdening the family financially. "I see," he said finally. "Well, this isn't over. We'll appeal." "You could," Michael interjected mildly. Though Judge Peterson's ruling was quite thorough, appeals in preservation cases rarely succeed when original documentation of intent exists. The legal fees would be substantial. Uncle James fell silent, the cost-benefit calculation almost visible on his face. Ms. Whitfield murmured something in his ear, and he nodded curtly before addressing me again. "I need time to consider options. In the meantime, the conservatorship remains in effect. The house is still under my legal control, even if certain decisions now require your input." With that parting reminder, he turned and walked away, Ms. Whitfield keeping pace beside him. "He's right about the conservatorship," Michael admitted as we watched them leave. "But it's a hollow victory for him now. The most valuable aspect of the property, development potential, has been effectively neutralized by today's ruling." Westbrook checked his watch. We should continue cataloging the hidden room's contents while we have legal access under the court order. Would you like to join us at Harrington House this afternoon, Ms. Reed? The opportunity to return to Harrington House to examine the hidden archive room personally after weeks of exclusion was immensely appealing. Absolutely. 3 hours later, I stood in the library of Harrington House, experiencing the strange sensation of being simultaneously a visitor and the rightful steward of the space. Mrs. Bennet had greeted me with quiet satisfaction when I arrived with the Historical Society team, while Uncle James had retreated to his study, unwilling to witness my court-sanctioned presence in the home he still considered exclusively his. The hidden room beyond Elizabeth Harrington's portrait was even more remarkable in person than it had appeared through Westbrook's video call. Stepping into the small space felt like entering a time capsule, the air still carrying traces of leather bindings, old paper, and furniture polish from decades past. Professor Sullivan expertly cataloged the contents, identifying ledgers dating back to Thomas Harrington's earliest business ventures, personal correspondence between generations of family members, and architectural specifications for alterations made to the house over its first 50 years. The most significant find was a letter from Thomas Harrington to his son, dated 1899, explicitly discussing the purpose of the hidden room. I have created this private archive to ensure certain documents remain accessible only to those who value preservation above profit. The agreements securing our family homestead against future destruction or division must be protected from those who might prioritize immediate gain over lasting legacy. When the time comes that these protections are needed, the room will reveal itself to the rightful guardian. Reading my great-great-grandfather's words, I felt a profound connection across generations, a shared understanding of what truly mattered about Harrington House. It wasn't the property value or social status it conferred, but the living connection to history it represented. As we worked to document the room's contents, Meredith unexpectedly appeared in the library doorway. She glanced over her shoulder, ensuring no one had followed her, before approaching. "Dad's locked himself in his study, with a bottle of scotch," she reported quietly. "I thought you should know I've decided to withdraw from the will contest. I'll be submitting formal notification to the court tomorrow." This unexpected development took me by surprise. "Meredith, that's significant. Are you sure?" She nodded, her expression resolute. "Watching this battle unfold has clarified what matters to me. I don't want grandfather's legacy to be endless legal fights and family divisions." She glanced toward the hidden room. "Besides, seeing how many generations of Harringtons worked to preserve this place, it seems wrong to be part of trying to dismantle it." Her decision wouldn't end the legal proceedings. Uncle James and Lawrence would certainly continue their challenge. But it represented a meaningful crack in the united front they had initially presented. "What will your father say?" I asked. She offered a wry smile. "He'll be furious, of course. But I'm an adult with my own career and life in Boston. His disapproval isn't the devastating weapon it once was." She hesitated, then added, "I'd still like to visit sometimes if that's possible. There are memories here I'm not ready to abandon entirely." "Of course," I assured her. "That was never in question. This house belongs to all of us in different ways, even if the legal responsibilities fall to me." Over the following weeks, the legal landscape surrounding Harrington House continued to evolve. Faced with the preservation ruling and Meredith's defection from the will contest, Uncle James reluctantly proposed a settlement. He would withdraw his challenge to my grandfather's trust in exchange for certain financial considerations, essentially accepting a larger cash inheritance while relinquishing claims to the property itself. Michael advised accepting these terms. Litigation could drag on for years, even if we're likely to prevail eventually. Settlement provides certainty and allows you to focus on restoration and preservation rather than legal battles. The terms were finalized in late October, 6 months after my grandfather's death. The conservatorship was dissolved, and control of Harrington House officially transferred to me as trustee of the Harrington House Historical Trust. Uncle James and Lawrence moved out the following week, returning to their respective homes and lives. Our family connections strained, but not entirely severed. Mrs. Bennet stayed on, her intimate knowledge of the house and its needs proving invaluable as I began implementing the preservation plans my grandfather and I had developed. The Historical Society provided technical assistance, with Professor Eig Sullivan serving as consulting architect for restoration projects. The first major undertaking was assessing and repairing damage from Lawrence and Uncle James's brief tenure as conservators. Most of the removed furniture and artwork was recovered from storage, though some pieces Lawrence had gifted to friends required more complicated negotiations to retrieve. By Thanksgiving, enough progress had been made to host a small gathering. At Harrington House, my mother, Meredith, who had maintained her independent position despite her father's disapproval, Daniel Westbrook, and a few close friends who had supported me throughout the ordeal. As we sat in the dining room where my grandfather had announced his intentions for the property nearly a year earlier, I felt his presence almost tangibly. The table settings gleamed in the candlelight, the portraits of ancestors watched from the walls, and the house itself seemed to embrace us, its soul intact despite the challenges it had weathered. After dinner, I took a quiet moment alone in the library, settling into my grandfather's favorite chair beside the portrait wall. The hidden room had been properly documented now, its contents carefully preserved while remaining accessible for legitimate research. Elizabeth Harrington's watchful eyes seemed to hold a hint of approval from her gilt frame. "We did it, grandfather," I whispered to the empty room that somehow didn't feel empty at all. "Harrington House is safe. The preservation designation had been made permanent. The trust was securely established, and the property would remain intact for future generations, not as a museum frozen in time, but as a living connection to history that would continue to evolve while respecting its past." The cousins who had locked me out, declaring me not welcome on Harrington property, had themselves departed, leaving me with the keys, both literal and figurative, to a legacy that had always been meant for someone who truly understood its value. Outside, the first snow of the season began falling gently, dusting the gardens where 7 generations of Harringtons had walked. Inside, protected by walls that had stood for nearly 150 years, I was finally, indisputably home. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.